I got two more questions for you when it comes to the internet and WCW. And one of the major questions are, in 1998, you're doing a Prodigy chat again. Now, you were the heel character again, leader of the NWO. And the first question you get is about the termination of Sean Waltman. I'm going to read you your response. And part of the reason why I'm reading it is because I think you are not the same person you were back then. I hired Sean Waltman because of Hall and Nash, and they basically terminated Sean Waltman because of a combination of Hall and Nash and Waltman's neck injury. Both Scott Hall and Kevin Nash have a track record, both in the WWF and here in WCW, being fairly disruptive in the locker room. I made it clear to Scott Hall on the very first day he came back that one of the things I was most proud and protective of in WCW was that the locker room and the production team was a pretty positive environment. Not to say there weren't problems from time to time, but by and large, our locker room is a positive place to be. I pointed out to Scott Hall because of his track record in the WWF, and I told him I didn't want him to bring that over to WCW. Do you regret handling everything with Sean publicly, loudly, sending the warning shots across the boat at Scott and Kevin, along with firing of Sean? Because in 2024, that Eric Bischoff doesn't strike me as someone who would fire a wrestler for being injury prone or to make a point to the wrestler's friends who his hiring was a favor to.
Is this the time I fired Sean and he went to WWE and started doing the Attitude Era gimmick?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I didn't fire Sean because of his neck injury. And clearly I was in character. I fired Sean because Sean and I had come to an agreement for a renewal, an extension. Everything had been agreed upon. Turner being Turner, it took, longer than it probably should have for the contract and we had a deal memo. I mean, there was documentation, but by the time the final contract, the contract we were all to sign, not just the deal memo, by the time that showed up, it might have been a month later, 3 weeks later. Well, somehow in the middle of that period of time, somebody convinced, I don't know, his name was probably Barry Bloom, convinced Sean Waltman that, I know we agreed on it. We shook hands and we signed a deal memo, but I think we can get more money than that. Or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
So they came back to me and said, Barry came back to me and said, well, I know, we get the deal memo, but Sean would really like to renegotiate. It's okay. He's fired. Take your client, tell him to go home, deal's off the table. And I pulled the deal memo and the deal that we had, I pulled it off the table. I want to say I had our attorneys do it, right? That was it. I was done with him. And look, Sean and I have talked a lot about this. Sean's a dear friend. I respect the hell out of him. We're very good friends. We've talked about this. Am I the same person, then as I am now? Of course not. I've mellowed some. I'm a little wiser, learned different things and different ways to handle different situations. But if something like that similar happened to this day, the result would be probably pretty close. Because at that point, that's someone that I can't trust. You shake hands, you agree to a deal, you have a deal memo with all the major points figured out. Shake hands, boom, we're going to go do it. Okay, off we go. We'll plan accordingly. And then to come back and go, I thought about it, I changed my mind. Not somebody I want to do business with. So I don't regret firing him for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I would have just been honest about it, it'd probably been better than kind of taking it out on Scott and Kevin and blaming it on his neck and firing a guy that was, injured in the ring and was injury prone. I mean, right. I knew that would get heat. That's why I said it.
Right.
But I don't know that was the best thing to do.
Speaking of things now in your current 2024 state, Conrad put a poll up the other day regarding questions with you and Bret Hart. And I hate to invoke his name, but one of the questions that stood out to me was, how much do you agree Bret's recollection of events from the late 90s and early 2000s? And more precisely, do you think Bret misremembers things or does he just have a different perspective than you on how things went in WCW?
I think it's the latter. I think Bret he's an honest person. I don't think he is intentionally misleading in any way, shape, or form. He's got a lot of integrity. So that's not the issue with Bret. But one of the things that I've learned, this is one of the things that I have learned that I'm really grateful for, that I didn't really, I didn't have this perspective back in the 80s or 90s. But you and I, Derek, could be walking down the street and looking straight ahead while we're talking, paying attention, and there could be a car wreck right in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
And 20 minutes after that car wreck, you're going to remember details differently than I remember details.
Sure.
Because you were looking at that moment that those two cars made contact, and you heard it maybe first, or then you saw it, or maybe you saw it, then you heard it, whatever. But you had a very unique perspective, and you remember what was going through your mind at that very moment. And part of what was going through your mind may have been 15 or 20 different thoughts. Point is, you had your own perspective and you had your own thoughts going on in your mind when you saw the same incident that I saw, but I had an entirely different movie playing in my head because I was looking at that scene from an entirely different angle and I had other things going on in my mind, right? So two people can see the same thing at the same time and have two entirely different perspectives. They may agree on some of the things, but there's going to be some things that they didn't see the same way. Therefore, they don't remember the same way. And I've learned that because over the years, especially doing this podcast, I've, had Conrad play clips back or read me things that, people that are to this day, very close friends of mine, he's read me some of their quotes and things that they've said. And I'm thinking, well, not really. I mean, cool story. I get it, but not really. And at first it was like, well, why do these guys say this stuff? Why would you do that? It's not necessary. And then I start, answering questions about things that happened years and years and years ago. And I'm telling the story from my perspective. And I'll have somebody that's really close to me call me and say, whatever, just want to let you know, it's not quite like that. And I found myself, remembering things differently than people that were in the room with me remember them. And when you start telling these stories over and over again, we're entertainers.
Sure.
Anytime I tell a story, I try to make it entertaining, right? That's why people listen, hopefully. And over time, as you're polishing this story up and you really don't remember it from the same perspective as everybody else in the room did, you can have different stories. You can have different feelings. You can have different perspectives about the same thing. So I've learned that. And that's why when I hear things that I disagree with and are not the way that I remember them, my default isn't someone's lying or someone's misleading. I don't go there. Just go, okay, well, that's how Bret remembers that. From his perspective, he believes it. Just he wasn't looking at it the same way I was, nor it would have been impossible for him to. So I get it.
I saw that you tweeted out that you saw him in Australia. You guys shook hands. I'm not sitting here saying that you guys sat down and had a beer and caught up over good times, but there's nothing animosity, nothing in your face, nothing man to man that would be confrontational with Bret, would there?
No, Bret's no. Look, I've certainly reconciled. Bret and I are never going to be friends, and that's cool. Sure. It's unfortunate, because there's a lot of things I like about Bret. We have a lot of things in common, believe it or not. Outside of wrestling, but I respect Bret, and sometimes I'm disappointed for Bret because he's so dark and there's always somebody he's got to bury and hate and accuse of and, criticize. And I just, for me, you know, carrying all that garbage around with me every single day or every time somebody put a microphone on my face would be really depressing.
It'd be heavy.
I just wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't talk to anybody anymore. If it made me that angry, made me that depressed, I wouldn't want to talk about it. I'd rather talk about my dog. But hey, that's Bret, man. He's got to live in his own skin. Maybe he's really happy. Maybe he likes being the way he is. I don't know. But he just seems very dark to me. Look, when Bret came in, Bret doesn't remember things this way. Bret wasn't looking at Bret the same way everybody else was looking at Bret at the time, or at least I was. Bret was emotionally very, very defeated. The Montreal screw job, that incident in Montreal took way more out of Bret than anybody realizes emotionally. And, you know, the divorce from Vince and WWE, I think it still bothers him in some ways. It's very hard. And I get it, not being critical of it at all. Bret felt like he was going to be in WWE for life. You heard him in, you know, the documentary. It was tough. It was really hard on him emotionally. He admits to it. That's what I got. I got a guy that was kind of half-ass broken. Still wasn't over the divorce. You were married before. I was married before. You know that transition.
Yeah. It's a tough rebound.
It's and that's where Bret was. Now, I'm not saying that that was the only reason. It certainly wasn't. There was a lot of, you know, I didn't handle the creative as well as I could have. But people also need to keep in mind, it's not like I've been planning for 6 months to get my hands on Bret. I get a fucking phone call out of the blue. Bret tells me, hey, Vince can't afford to pay me. Do I still have a job in WCW? Essentially, it's not the conversation. But
Right.
and it was like, well, yeah, sure. Come on in. We'll figure it out when you get here. So, you know, it's not like, oh, I had this great opportunity and all this time to plan. Okay, we've got an entire 3 months worth of pay-per-views booked. Let's sit down and rebook them because we know we're going to have Bret. I didn't have that luxury.
Right.
He just dropped out of the sky. So it was what it was. I feel bad that Bret is disappointed in all of it as he is and whatever. I feel pretty good about myself. So
I appreciate
you go be you, Bret.